right.
So let me start out by saying, guys, that it is a great opportunity and privilege to be here and be able to share with you something that God has been processing me with and talking to me with throughout this season in my life. And I want to talk to you about the story of Abraham. Abraham is one of the many characters, just like David, and several other stories, in the Bible. Adam, people are pretty well aware of or know it. And also another story is the story of Daniel. We all know about, he was in the den with the lions. But the thing that is that we always talk about, so Abraham had a son, but very few people go into depth and remember the part where God asked Abraham to give him his son. And so I want to share today with you a little bit about the story of Abraham. So there was once a man named Abram. One day the Lord came to Abram and asked, Abram asked and said, who will inherit all what I have? And so God promised Abram and his wife Sarah, that one day they would be parents. And they were 70 something years old, 75. And so just think about it. There's people in our age that can't have kids, that struggle with it. And now imagine someone that's 70, you tell them you're gonna have kids. Funny God. And God wasn't sure Abrams understood that. So, he's like, look up in the heaven, look up in the sky. So Abram looks and he's like, you see those stars? And so I can imagine Abram just sitting there trying to count the stars, because I don't know if any of y'all have ever kind of laid out or gone stargazing. I absolutely love that. And but you sit there and try to count the stars, and then you're right here, but then when you go right here, you're like, oh wait, did I count that star? And you're at 500 probably. And so Abram couldn't count that, and God was like, that's how your descendants will be. That's how much. And those descendants, that includes us, you and I. And so a few years later, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord decides to come to him, and he's like, I'm going to change your name. And he changes his name to Abraham, which means father of many. And then not only does he change his name, but he also changes the name of his wife, Sarai, to Sarah. Hey, you're going to be parents. And he said, they're going to have a boy. And this time, Abraham laughed so hard, and he fell on his face. It says that he fell on his face. It was hard to believe that him and Sarah would have a child at their old age. One day it says in the Bible that 3 visitors came to Abraham's house. And it says that he hurried up to meet and greet them, and he went and told his men to go prepare something for them to eat and drink. And he's like, come in and join us and rest, come in and join us and rest. And so the visitors agreed. And so Abraham brought them some fresh bread, milk, and just like when someone comes into your house, for us, our culture, we're always like, someone comes into their house, you're like, hey, come here, you're giving you everything, and people are like, So, yeah, and so that's what I can imagine Abraham did. And then one of the visitors asked, he replied, he's like, Abram, where's your wife? And he's like, she's in the other room. Then one of the men said, I will come back to see you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. So it's like, again, not only you told me this. And so Sarah was listening in the other room, Me, I'm a little bit nosy, so I'm always like hearing a little bit more than I should. And so I can only imagine Sarah was like, she started laughing because I know there's like been several times where like people say, oh, something will happen. I'm like, huh, joke's on you. Like, no, that's not gonna happen. But like Sarah started laughing, but covered her mouth and laughed to herself because she didn't want to be heard. Then she said to herself, how can I have a child? I am almost 100 years old. And then we continue through the book of Genesis onto the chapters, and it says that God does indeed give Sarah a child, and his name is Isaac. And that the meaning of the name Isaac is laughter, which is funny, like, yeah. So here is this thing that, they've been told so many years, you're going to have this child, you're going to have this kid, he's going to be the one, he is the key to this promise that God has given to Abraham and Sarah. But then God comes to Abraham, he's like, I'm going to test him. I want you, he's like, give me Isaac. And this is where I'm going to start preaching, sharing the word. So we'll bow our heads now. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for this opportunity that you've given me, and for these people to be here, Father, and my fellow classmates, to be able to hear this word that you've given to me and placed in my heart, Father. But most of all, Father, you have taught me through it, Father, before it has reached to them, Father. I ask that this word that I share, Father, just, reaches their inner selves, Father, and makes them question, Father, the things that you have given them, Father, and to truly trust you in the midst of the things that we don't know what's going on. Father, I ask that you open their minds and hearts, Father, to receive this word that's going to be shared to them, Father. And I ask, Father, that when they leave today, Father, it's just not another sermon they heard, Father, but that when they leave, they'll leave transformed, Father, and knowing that there was something in here in this sermon that you had prepared from them beforehand. And I just ask that you just speak, Holy Spirit. I give you control over everything, Father. And may you just speak what you have to speak through me, and may I just be an instrument to your glory. In your name we pray, amen. So I'm going to be reading to you from Genesis 22 from verse 1 to 13. And it says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. What did God say? What did God say? He said, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and rose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, it says, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with a donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship, and will come again to see you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hands the fire and the knife. So they both went of them together. And then Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father? And he said, here I am, son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. And the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, him was a ram, and behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So, my question for you today is, what is your Isaac? Who is your Isaac? And you might say, Jacqueline, but what do you mean? I mean, when I say Isaac, what is that one thing that means the world to you? What is that thing that you've prayed, not 1, not 2, but 5, 6, and maybe 10 years to God to give to you? What is that job that you've been working so hard at to get? But then God's like, give it to me. We all have Isaacs in our life. No one can say, oh, I don't have an Isaac, because there's one thing. It doesn't matter, even if you are a person that does not like to attach themselves to anyone, there's one thing in this world that we all feel attached to. There's one thing that you love. And so, for me, my Isaac is my family. I love them. I will fight for them. My Isaac is my family. But what is your Isaac? But now that you've maybe identified what is your Isaac, how do you respond to God when He asks you to trust Him with it? Are we like Abe? Do we give it to Him? Or do we sit here and fight God on it? And I shared with you earlier that my Isaac is my family. Recently on January, this past month, I wasn't here. I started school a little bit late and stuff. But I saw my Isaac on a bed. He had a stroke. That's my grandfather. You know, the person that I love, the person that, raised me, the person that taught me how to drive, the person that dropped me off in college was now in a bed, paralyzed with his left side of his body, not being able to move it. For me, that made me question everything. It made me question my faith. Because I was like, God, if you loved him so much and if you love me so much, where is this at? Where is this that you're going to take care of him? You're taking him away from me. And in that moment, when everything was going downhill, honestly, I couldn't trust God with my Isaac. And every time I look back at this, and as I was preparing the sermon, I'm like, wow, like Abraham is a true, I want to be like him. I want that. And it didn't happen overnight. It took years for it. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take years for us to trust God, to have faith in God. But at the end, we see that God is faithful. So like I said, we all have Isaacs in our family. For me, my Isaac is my family. There's that one thing I will not joke about, and it's my family. But the interesting thing is that God uses those Isaacs to test us. God uses those Isaacs to bring out the best in us. And we see that in Genesis 22, that God tested Abraham with his Isaac, and with his actual Isaac, his one and only son. And so, I'm sorry, but that's heck of painful. That's super painful, and this is my first time I've ever had, I've always been like the person like, yeah, trust everything, live in God's hands. I always tell people like, live in God's hands, let's pray for this. But it's not until it hits you and it hits your heart and it's tugging at it that you're like, do I really trust God with my Isaac? Do you really trust God with that job that your whole family depends on because you're the only person working? And I want to talk to you today about the 3 T's. And Abraham faced them, you will face them, have faced them, or are facing them. And it's called trust. It's not that test, trust, and triumph. So let's look at verse 1 of 22. And it says, after these things, God tested Abraham. What an interesting way to stop, right? God tested Abraham. And imagine, spending 10 years of your life praying for something that you really want. For us, it would be, you've been praying 2 years. But imagine, praying 10 years for something, now add 20 more years for that. That's how long Abraham had to wait in order for his prayer to be answered. Well, he's like, who's going to inherit all that I have? And, it's so hard. It's so hard to trust God with that thing that you've been praying so much about. And for Abraham, it was his son. I'm always amused by the way that God asked him before, the way that God asked him is like, take your son, your only son, whom you love. And in the NIV version or the CBS, there is interesting how they, the translation of it, it says, never mind, that's right. He says, take your only son, the one you love. Like, have you ever gotten, cut? And it's like, you hit it and it hurts more. And so that's what kind of like, God was doing with Abraham. Like, give me your son. That was like a hit. But he's like, give me your one and only son. Ouch. The one you love. Another hit. Ouch. That hurts. Like, God had already shattered him when he's like, give me Isaac. But your one and only and the one you love. I mean, God was trying to be funny right there. Like in a funny that's hurtful. And it's amusing, and before I don't want you to, don't think about the fact, because sometimes when I share this story with people or something, they quickly, jump to the conclusion, God wasn't going to kill Isaac. No, don't think about that. Think the way Abraham was thinking, because he did not know that. He didn't know that God was gonna stop him in the midst. He didn't know that. He just knew that he was being tested in the midst of that. So God was just like, give me your son. And I think it would have been enough if God would have been like, take your son, But the way his wording, wordsmithing. God's good at that, actually. But the way that God, told Abraham, it was not, he was not trying to forget Ishmael or by saying, Ishmael doesn't count. But he was reminding Abraham that this was the son that carried the promise. So God was in a way kind of rubbing it in his face. And we have to remember that he was the key. He was the key. He didn't know what the rest of the story was, but God was testing him in the midst of it, in the midst of all that. And there's one thing that my grandmother, growing up, she always told me, and she says it in Spanish, but she always says, she's like, hold lightly to what you value the most because it doesn't belong to you. And you're like, well, what the heck? Like, how are you hold lightly to something you value the most? You're actually supposed to, hold on tighter to it. And she's like, Jackeline, she always tells me, she's like, just look at you. She's like, one day you're gonna get married, you're gonna leave this house, you're not gonna be with your mom and dad. And that goes for same as y'all. One day you're gonna leave your house and your parents and all that. And some of us are here are married. Not me. And so, but she's like, I can't sit here and cry all day. She's like, because you're a gift from God. She's like, and even though I love you, she's like, I can't hold you my whole entire life. She's like, you have to fly. We have to hold lightly what you value the most because a lot of times that's what God's gonna ask you for. And so, I want to talk to you about the second point, which is trust. Even though Isaac was the only one that Abraham loved the most, God was asking him to give it back to him. And that requires a trust. And we see that in the chapters. Abraham wasn't, God, what was going on? Why am I going to give you Abraham? You just promised me, descendants. Why am I going to give you the only thing that you've given me to fulfill the promise? Why? You're like, I ask myself, God, why are you taking the person that I most love? And I'm like, God, I still want him to be the person to walk me down the aisle. I still want him to see me when I graduate from college. How he always says, "Tú eres mi orgullo." It's painful when God asks you, because it was painful for me. I remember running vividly to the chapel when they had told us my grandfather had a stroke and then they had just got, it had evolved. I remember running to that chapel in that hospital and just screaming and just telling God all these things. It's hard. It's hard when God asks you to give him what you most love, but we have to trust him. And faith isn't believing something that's there. It's believing and trusting God for something that's not there. Believing in the impossible. And we see that in the impossible is that I am possible. And we see that through God. And so, honestly, if I was in Abraham's place, I don't know, I wouldn't have been able to. I probably, knowing how I am, I would try to persuade God differently. I would have been like, God, is there not a different way to do this? But we see something very interesting is that Abe trusted God. And because coming from where I am, like my grandfather, I didn't trust God. Like I told y'all earlier, I questioned my faith in everything. And so we question God in those times of test. And Abraham didn't do that. And it's truly amazing if we look into the verse that when God told him that, he said he woke up the next day, he got his guys ready, he got his son. But the funny thing, and this is the thing that is bizarre, it's phenomenally amazing. I don't even know if that's a word, but it's amazing. And is that Abraham tells the servant, he's like, stay here with the donkey. He tells this to his men. He's like, I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And if you look at other verses, and like the NIV, the SBS, the CBS, it says, we will go up, worship, and worship. And it says, and then we will come back to you. That's mind-blowing. He was certain that God was going to do something. And then we can skip on to the other verses when Isaac asked his dad. He's like, hey, Daddy, here's the fire and here's the wood and all that. He's like, but where's the offering? That must have been the hardest question anyone can ask their father at that moment. I can imagine, Abraham probably turned around, his dad, like his son, Abraham just turned around, and Isaac's right here. So I can imagine, like, when he asked him that, his eyes were probably teared up, and he had a knot in his throat. But he said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. He was certain that God was going to provide. He didn't know how, but he trusted God. And that is what we have to do with our Isaacs. We don't know when God's asking us or what he's asking us for, but one thing is for certain, that we have to trust him because he will provide a way. He will provide a way. God provides a way. And the thing is that God doesn't, when he asks us to give him the thing that we most love, a lot of times it's like, God, I surrender everything to you. But God is asking you, have you really surrendered everything to me? Have you surrendered what you most love? Have you surrendered that? Have you surrendered to me, your Isaac? God is not going to give you the big things in life until you know how to give him the small ones. And I'm not saying Isaac was a small thing, because he was the key to the promise. What I am saying is that we have to give him our Isaacs in order for him to see that our heart is truly in him. And in that way, we will see his promise fulfilled, that he will multiply our descendants like in the stars, like on the sand on the sea. It requires this action, and this question that God is asking us requires an action that requires trust. So whatever Isaac, God is asking you, it requires trust. God commanded him to offer his son Isaac. And it's funny because Isaac was the one that was going to carry the offspring, and the promise and the command seemed to contradict each other. God, you're telling me this, but this is actually going to happen if I do this. So it's like, what? And, I can only imagine what's going through, Abraham's head. Try to imagine that. And so, if one looks, continues to verse 9, it says that he built an altar there, and he was really going to do it. He had done tied up his son, his one and only son, had done tied up that boy, and was going to sacrifice him. Ugh. But then it says that God's voice came around. He was like, Abraham, Abraham. He was also listening to the voice of God in the midst of all that. We always have to be listening to the voice of God. Faith is truly believing and leaving everything in the hands of God. Like I said earlier, he didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know how God was going to do it. But he knew that God would do it somehow. God would do it somehow. And so, for me, those days were horrifying. It's how do I trust God? But then, as the days went by, I started having this peace. I'm like, I don't know, but I know God's going to get him and us through this. And I was trusting. I don't know how God was going to do it. And I still don't know how everything has looked with him, with my Isaac. So, God says go, and we go. If he says stop, we should stop. And he says, give me your dearest possessions. Even though if you're like, oh, no, we have to offer it to him, because it is then when he sees that our heart is truly in him. Until the last T is triumph. And I think it's very interesting how twice in this chapter, Abraham, he expects that somehow God was going to work in. God was going to work things out, and that Isaac would live. And so, going back to what I shared with you earlier about he told his men, he's like, we will come back down. He's like, he didn't just say I, he said we. Like, he knew that God was going to triumph over it. And we have to realize this, that God is God, and he's Alpha and Omega, beginning and the end. There's nothing in this world impossible for God. The promise that God has given you, your family, or for your career, or whatever it is, he is going to fulfill it. But we must be rooted in him, and we must be trusting in him, and we must be hearing his voice. And so he didn't withhold anything from God. He was really trusting God. And we see that at the end, God does provide a ram. In the thickets behind him, God provides a ram. And so for 2,000 years, Christians have seen this story, a picture of the death and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. In Genesis 22, we see what a man would do for the love of God. But in the four Gospels, in the New Testament, we see what God would do for man, to send his one and only Son. God was asking him to sacrifice his one and only Son, but God sacrificed his one and only Son for you and for me, so that we may have eternal life. So that plan that one day was, a little messed up because of the decisions of someone, but God's like, you know what? He already had another plan in motion. He's like, I'm going to send my one and only Son so that this relationship can continue. And so, more than that, Jesus endured physical pain and spiritual death to obtain redemption for sinners, me and you. When God's hand was raised at Calvary, there was no one to stop and say, don't harm the child. No one said, don't harm Jesus. There was no ram in the thicket to offer in his place. God's hand fell in judgment on his only Son.
All right, good job, Jackeline.
Very good.
Just because we're running out of time here, let me go over stuff. I like how you're connecting Isaac with us. So what do we value most? What are we willing to give up? That's a really solid sermon theme. So that you did a really good job on that. I would really work with the sermon flow and the wordsmithing and just knowing your notes. Okay. When you knew your material, you came across really emotively well. But then when you had the gaps, that's where it shifted a bit. You were in the midst of your gospel presentation, so I didn't get to hear it all, but it needs to be clear. Your tie-in with Christ is the obvious tie-in in this passage, so it makes sense. And then sometimes so the emotive was really strong, but then sometimes it's at odds with the message, and so there are times when you're talking about your grandfather, but you're smiling, and it's, you want to allow that, and it's hard because it's fresh for you. So that's where it's sometimes better to preach out of your wounds than it is your scars instead of your wounds, yeah. So, so watch the fillers as you watch the video. You have a lot of likes, a lot of you knows. When you have people turn in the Bible, give them time to turn there. Okay, so open up to whatever. This is for all of you. The pulpit, it has a really small top to it. So you're going to need to find a way to get your notes into your Bible on the pulpit. Because you kept going back and forth, Bible on the side, and notes on the side, and top, and it just, it distracts from it. So you have really good movement. So I like that you're moving, and you're moving well with what you're speaking. I'm just going to say make it more purposeful. So think about the movements that you're making and why you're making them. But you have really good movement, really good pauses. Several places you have solid pauses that really helped us to kind of think through exactly what you just said. So that was really good. I'm old, but there are going to be old people in your church. This doesn't really offend me at all, but I know you want to stay away from hecka and heck, right? I don't care, it doesn't bother me, but there will be people that are bothered by that, all right? God was being really funny when he hurt Abraham, and that's just part of that wordsmithing.
Yeah.
Know what you want to say.
Yeah, and then I realized it like that.
Yeah, know your notes better, but a really good start. Well done. Good job.
Good job.